If you think that all the information you have about France, Germany, and Britain's oppression in Africa was either leaked or given by the local people, you are wrong. Whatever you know about the horrific slave trade is exactly what the colonizers want you to know. Whenever people think about the slave trade, they simply think slaves were captured and brought to Europe and America. However, the details are never told. What was done to the tribes which did not offer slaves and resisted? How were the slaves captured and stored in hundreds in small basements with small lids so they didn't run away? The most terrible form of colonization and oppression done by European colonizers was in Togo, and most people don't know about it at all. So, what did France, Germany, and Britain do in Togo that they are today ashamed to tell you about? Let's find out in this video. Today, many people are unaware of Togo and the deep colonial scars it bears. During the slave trade and the colonial era, various European powers transformed Togo into a major slave port, where countless enslaved Africans were shipped to Europe and America. Togo's coast, especially around present-day Anejo, became a key hub for the slave trade. Europeans, including the Portuguese, Dutch, British, and French, set up trading posts where enslaved Africans were held before being transported across the Atlantic. Captured from various inland regions, these individuals were forced to march to the coast, often under horrific conditions. Once at the coast, enslaved people were confined in overcrowded and disease-ridden dungeons. The conditions were brutal, with many dying before they even boarded the ships. Those who survived faced the notorious Middle Passage, where disease, malnutrition, and abuse were rampant, resulting in high mortality rates. No matter what colonial master came, the conditions and slave trade remained intact. But how many colonizers colonized Togo? In 1884, Germany established Togoland as a colony, enforcing a regime of harsh forced labor and strict administration. The Germans focused on extracting resources and developing cash crops like cocoa, coffee, and cotton, often at the expense of the local population's well-being. Infrastructure improvements primarily served colonial interests, further entrenching exploitation. After World War I, Togoland was divided between French and British rule. The French continued the exploitation with heavy taxes and forced labor. This period also saw rising Togolese nationalism and resistance, setting the stage for future independence movements. But let's go back a little to know how it all began. In 1700, the region now known as the Republic of Togo faced severe challenges. Tropical diseases like malaria and yellow fever were widespread in the area's hot and humid climate, leading to high mortality rates among European slave traders who lacked immunity. The intense heat made long-term settlement difficult for the Portuguese. The Yu tribes of the West African coast, skilled in ironwork, resisted Portuguese control through rebellions. By the early 18th century, the Portuguese, unable to maintain their trading posts, gradually abandoned the slave trade, leaving behind a significant number of firearms. This newfound freedom for the Yu people was short-lived. Armed with powerful guns, the United Kingdom of Denmark-Norway, the French, and the British returned to capture more slaves. Yu kings and leaders were asked to hand over slaves in exchange for gifts. When chiefs refused to participate, it disrupted the supply chain and threatened the profits of the European slave traders. In response, Europeans resorted to coercion, intimidation, and military force. Villages were ravaged, and chiefs who refused were executed and replaced by those who would comply. If that was not enough, colonizers would come to the family of the tribal chief and intimidate them. Their honor was challenged, and when the tribal chief did not submit, wives and daughters of the chief were captured and taken to be never returned again. Sometimes they were sexually exploited and then sold as slaves to be transported to Europe and America. While the British Empire abolished slavery in 1833 with the Slavery Abolition Act effective in 1834, France and the US continued the practice until 1848 and 1865, respectively. In 1985, illegal slave houses were constructed to keep the lucrative business of human trafficking alive. One of the most horrific places was the House of Slaves, where captives were held before being shipped to Europe, the French colonies, or the Americas. Located 3 kilometers from the Atlantic coast in what was once a vegetated area, the Afro-Brazilian-style building had 6 rooms, a living room, 1.5-meter-wide corridors, and a 1.5-meter-high cellar beneath it. The upper rooms housed the slave traders, while the cellar confined the slaves, who were pushed in through several small windows. A trapdoor in the living room provided access to the cellar for the traders. The slaves could not stand in their confinement, highlighting the building's design for discretion in slave trafficking. Enslaved Africans confined within the house of slaves endured unspeakable hardships. The living quarters were designed to cram numerous individuals into tight spaces, providing little comfort or room to move. Cells and rooms were overcrowded, lacking proper ventilation and natural light, fostering an oppressive environment. Enslaved individuals grappled with filth and deprivation, struggling to access basic necessities like food, water, and sanitation. Conditions within the house of slaves were marked by cruelty and inhumanity. Enslaved Africans faced constant threats of disease and illness due to unsanitary conditions, resulting in widespread suffering and death from sickness and malnutrition. Additionally, they suffered brutal treatment at the hands of slave traders and overseers, enduring physical abuse through beatings, whippings, and other forms of violence meant to assert control. The atmosphere within the house of slaves was one of profound fear, despair, and uncertainty. Enslaved individuals lived in constant dread of being torn away from their families and thrust into a life of forced labor and servitude in distant lands. Many grappled with the anguish of not knowing what awaited them beyond the confines of the trading post, facing the prospect of a traumatic and irreversible separation from their homeland, culture, and loved ones. For captured Africans, leaving the house of slaves marked the beginning of a perilous journey known as the Middle Passage. Forced onto slave ships, they endured the horrors of the transatlantic crossing, enduring unimaginable suffering and brutality. The trauma of being forcibly separated from their homes and families left a lasting imprint on generations of enslaved Africans and their descendants, shaping their lives for years to come. But what was the well of the chain that no history book talks about? Well, European colonizers had simply no limits on the oppressions they wanted to inflict. Because they had captured Africans who were living a peaceful life, they feared their God might help them resist. Therefore, near the house of slaves, on the path to the ocean, was the well of the chained, where slaves bathed before boarding ships to the Americas. You will not get much information about this well because it represents Europeans' fear. However, according to oral tradition, slaves circled the well 7 times to break ties with their deities, ensuring they abandoned any supernatural powers that might enable a mutiny. The European colonizers and slave traders wanted only the slaves to come with them, not their God who might cause them to revolt. This shows that there was a distorted form of fear that the slave traders felt. But what happened to Togo during the Berlin Conference? During the Berlin Conference from November 1884 to February 1885, European powers took it upon themselves to divide Africa, disregarding the input of the continent's indigenous peoples. Africa, revered as the birthplace of humanity and home to diverse cultures and ancient wisdom, was reduced to mere lines on a map. Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Portugal, Belgium, Italy, and Spain, driven by greed and lacking empathy, paid no heed to the connections and vibrant lives of countless African communities. The cradle of mankind was ruthlessly transformed into a stage for colonial exploitation. Following the Berlin Conference, Germany assumed control over the lands, establishing the German Protectorate of Togoland. These protectorate arrangements aimed to safeguard territories from other European powers, ensuring defense and support against potential aggression. Germany enforced large-scale plantations, primarily managed by European settlers and companies, which heavily relied on coerced labor. Indigenous farmers were forced into cultivating cash crops like cocoa, coffee, and cotton, disrupting their traditional farming methods and ways of life. Forced labor became prevalent as people were coerced into working on plantations, construction projects, and railways under harsh conditions. This labor system was designed to maximize economic output for the Germans. European colonizers established schools focused on basic literacy and vocational training to cultivate a local workforce to serve their interests. These educational institutions, overseen by missionaries, propagated German language and culture, with limited access for the broader African population. But is it really true that Germany allowed education? There are various thoughts on this. Some believe that Europeans never allowed the local population to get an education. However, historical records were distorted later to prove that Africans were given equal opportunity for education to prove that they remained illiterate on their own choice. This seems like a lie. In reality, Europeans ensured that the local population never got an education, because if they did, they would unite and fight using the same moralities that Europe seems to advocate but not follow. However, selected individuals, who were carefully observed for their loyalty, were allowed to get an education so they could serve colonial purposes. Their education cannot be considered of any significance for the local people, because they were part of the colonial machinery. But did revolt take place? Well, in 1896, the Yu and other ethnic groups in Togoland revolted against German colonial rule, driven by grievances over forced labor, land seizures, and oppressive policies. Unlike what's told by the European colonizers that Africans never revolted and were happy with colonialism, revolts were frequent, despite being costly, resulting in loss of lives. The uprising, dubbed the Togo Rebellion, erupted in early 1896 as local communities united against German forces. Despite initial successes, the revolt was suppressed by mid-1896 due to the superior weaponry and military organization of the German colonial troops. The quelling of the revolt solidified German control over Togoland, leading to stricter governance and heightened colonial exploitation until World War I. People who revolted were highlighted and made the target of the harshest treatment to make an example. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. But what happened to Togo when World War I began? In August 1914, during the outbreak of the First World War, British and French forces launched a joint military campaign to seize Togoland. By the end of August 1914, Togoland had fallen to the Allied forces, marking the end of German colonial rule in the region. With Germany's defeat in World War I in November 1918, Togoland became a target for the Allies. In 1919, according to the Treaty of Versailles, Togoland was divided between France and Britain. The western part was placed under British administration as Togoland under British mandate, while the eastern section came under French control as Togoland under French mandate. The division of the country between Britain and France resulted in the separation of ethnic groups and families across the territory. The western portion administered by Britain included areas primarily inhabited by Yus and other ethnic groups, leading to a fragmented and divided region that continues to bear the scars of colonialism to this day. Meanwhile, in the eastern portion under French mandate, regions inhabited by the Yus and other ethnic groups were affected. This division disrupted long-standing social structures and separated communities that had shared cultural and familial ties for generations. Families found themselves living under different colonial administrations, causing fragmentation and dislocation within the indigenous population of Togoland. The new colonial administrations were no improvement over German rule. Under British control, British Togoland was part of the British Gold Coast, now modern-day Ghana. Conversely, the French directly governed their portion, imposing their language and educational systems. The German language was banned, and the forced labor system and economic exploitation resumed. Following World War II, the movement for independence surged across Africa. In British Togoland, a 1956 United Nations supervised plebiscite led to integration with the Gold Coast, forming modern-day Ghana in 1957. Sylvanus, Olympio, and other nationalist leaders campaigned, protested, and negotiated to challenge French colonial policies and demand self-governance. In 1956, the new country gained limited autonomy under French rule, with Nicolas Grunitzky serving as prime minister from 1956 to 1958, yet full independence was the people's goal. But what was the struggle for independence that Europeans hid? Well, they hid it because in 1959, Togolese women staged mass protests against French colonial rule, advocating for freedom and self-governance. Yes, women did not fear the colonizers, and their bold actions and widespread mobilization drew international attention. By 1960, the push for complete independence gained momentum, leading French Togoland to achieve full independence on April 27, 1960, becoming the Republic of Togo. Sylvanus Olympio assumed office as the first president, signifying the end of colonial rule and a new chapter for the Togolese people. But what did France do next to keep control over Togo? Well, during the wave of independence in Africa, European colonizers were shameless enough to try to colonize the newly independent colonies. They strategized to do this by either helping the opposition of the newly independent colonies' leaders or by assassinating them altogether. This would result in destruction, paving the way for the colonizers to rule until order is maintained. What ensued was France's manipulation and control of Togo, resulting in one of Africa's most brutal and secretive dictatorships. Olympio, educated in London and with experience in the United Africa Company, aimed for economic independence and France's departure from Togo. However, France had different plans. In 1961, rebel soldiers attempted a coup against President Olympio's government, but his administration thwarted it and maintained control. In 1962, Olympio introduced a Togolese national currency to replace the CFA franc, a significant move towards economic independence. This decision underscored Olympio's determination to assert Togo's sovereignty and liberate it from colonial remnants. And this was a major threat to French secret control over African countries. But how the CFA franc is used to this day to control African countries? This currency, designed to uphold a neo-colonial relationship with European powers, profoundly impacts African economies. Initially linked to the French franc and overseen by the European Central Bank, it's now tied to the euro. 14 African nations, including Togo, utilize the CFA franc, requiring them to deposit half of their foreign exchange reserves into the French treasury. In other words, this means that these 14 African countries have to deposit 50% of the GDP in French banks as long as this currency remains. In total, France earns about $400 to $500 billion every year from this colonial tax. Hundreds of billions of dollars, which should be used for these countries' prosperity and public services provisions, are being stored in the French treasury. So, what was the plan that France made against Sylvanus Olympio? Because Olympio wanted to end CFA franc, he had to be replaced. In 1963, French leaders, led by Charles de Gaulle and his African affairs advisor Jacques Foccart, aimed to oust Sylvanus Olympio, revered as the father of Togolese independence. Olympio's anti-French stance and dedication to Togo's autonomy posed a direct threat to French dominance in the area. However, France did not want to be involved directly. Therefore, France helped the military gain control. Former soldiers of the French colonial army, Emmanuel Bourgeois and Etienne Eyadema, sought inclusion in Togo's military, a move opposed by President Olympio due to distrust. Bourgeois and a team of 6 commandos attacked Olympio's residence. Sensing danger, Olympio fled barefoot through his garden, seeking asylum in the American embassy. However, he did not know that the very asylum givers would betray him. As per Olympio's son, the U.S. ambassador, Léon Poula, notified France of the president's location. Unbeknownst to them, France orchestrated the coup. At the time, the U.S. embassy in Lomé lacked security, making it vulnerable. The attackers, driven by ethnic and political grievances, primarily were from the northern Kabyle ethnic group, contrasting with Olympio's southern Yu ethnicity. In the aftermath, Emmanuel Bourgeois proudly claimed responsibility for shooting the president to French reporters. This event marked sub-Saharan Africa's first successful military coup and the initial assassination of a leader during such an uprising. Olympio's assassination swiftly drew condemnation from African leaders, spotlighting France's disruptive role on the continent. Julius Nyerere of Tanganyika urged the UN not to recognize Togo's new government until its innocence in Olympio's murder and democratic legitimacy were verified. However, instead of discouraging further coups, this action set off a series of military takeovers, with an average of 25 coups per decade occurring from the 1960s to the 1990s. By the late 1990s, 26 out of the 32 nations that signed the Organization of African Unity Charter had witnessed coups, with many experiencing them multiple times. The European powers were determined to prevent Africans from governing their own continent. Following the assassination of the first president, Sylvanus Olympio, Nicholas Grunitzky regained power with military support, intending to uphold Togo's strong ties with France. That's exactly what France wanted, to have a pro-French leader in power in Togo at the cost of a pro-Togo leader. However, fearing a potential uprising by the U people, the unpopular government of Nicholas was overthrown in another military coup led by Lieutenant Colonel Etienne Eyadema in 1967. Grunitzky was exiled to France following the coup, and Eyadema emerged as France's preferred leader. Born in 1935 in Pia, a village in northern Togo, Gnassingbé Eyadema was from the Kabye ethnic group. After joining the French army in 1953, he steadily climbed the ranks before returning to Togo. Upon seizing power in 1967, Eyadema established a one-party state, brutally suppressing political dissent. He bolstered the military to suppress the majority U ethnic group, deliberately fostering minority rule to avoid retaliation. Eyadema's rule was marked by ruthlessness, with opposition members often mutilated and thrown from helicopters into the sea. Gruesome torture methods were employed to quell any uprisings, with the Togolese army conducting shooting drills on civilians in 1983, using weapons provided by colonial masters. France, particularly under President Jacques Chirac, was complicit in Eyadema's oppressive regime, effectively achieving its goal of subjugating Togo. The nation's natural resources, such as gold and phosphate mines, were handed over to French companies. Agricultural products like cotton and cocoa were also exported to France. Despite surviving the plane crash and an assassination attempt by his bodyguard, Sergeant Ali Boubacar, Eyadema claimed invincibility, carrying the removed bullet as a charm. This served as a grim reminder of his ruthless grip on power, sustained through fear, oppression, and manipulation, ultimately benefiting French interests at the expense of Togo's populace. France had placed a man who would serve French interests, caring little for his own people. And today, Gnassingbé Eyadema's son is the president of Togo, representing the brutal form of oppression that France could do with any country. Did you know the conditions in which slaves from Africa were captured and transported to Europe and America? Isn't it true that all the records of the oppression we know today were carefully written by colonizers themselves to downplay the oppression? In the comment section right below, share your thoughts on the real scale of brutalities and oppression done in Togo that no history books talk about. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.